Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 51st episode of 2022. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Nokia, the gold sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. This morning, the Fiber Broadband Association issued a press release announcing the results of our annual fiber service provider study that highlights that we are now have 68 million fiber to the homes passed in the U.S. That's 68 million, which is up 13% over the previous year. So during next week's Fiber for Breakfast, we're going to have our researcher, Mike Render, come in, and he's going to walk us through our service provider study in detail. So if you're interested in hearing all about the fiber deployment numbers, join us next Wednesday. Just over a week ago, as it's, this huge Arctic cold front comes across the nation, I was at the Broadband Leaders Summit in warm and pleasant Coconut Grove in Miami, where I did my best to explain the quantum internet. I'm so excited to actually have a real quantum physicist as our guest today, who's going to do a much better job at discussing the quantum networks and their upcoming leap into the quantum age. But before we leap into quantum, I'd like to remind everybody that our first regional Fiber Connect workshop is just around the corner. It's going to be held in Raleigh, North Carolina on Tuesday, February 7th. Registration's open, and we hope that you'll join us. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Dr. Duncan Earl, the president, co-founder, and CTO of Qubitekk, who's going to be discussing is quantum the next killer app for fiber broadband. But before I introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehler's team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast gold sponsor, Nokia. Now, if you would all please keep in mind that everyone's in listen mode only. To ask a question, you can type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our expert at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. If you take a minute to do that, we certainly appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we heard from our good friend, Matt Collins of Calix, who shared with us strategies for winners. It's all about experience. And Matt explained how operators cannot rely on fiber speed alone, but they must continue to innovate to continuously improve the subscriber experience. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Dr. Duncan Earl, the president, co-founder, and CTO of Qubitekk, who's going to be discussing is quantum the next killer app for fiber broadband. And Dr. Earl is a physicist and founder of quantum networking company Qubitekk. He spent nearly 20 years conducting energy and defense-related research and development at Oak Ridge National Laboratories in the field of quantum sources, quantum computing, and quantum cryptography. Today, Duncan's focus lies squarely in applying his findings towards building quantum networks and critical precursors to the upcoming quantum-enabled internet. So welcome, Duncan. And for our audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll discuss those at the Q&A at the end. With that, let's get things started and turn it over to Duncan.
Thanks, Gary. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak today about quantum. Again, Mike, the company that I'm with is a company called Qubitekk, which is really one of many companies, across the world and definitely here in the United States, working to make quantum networking and other quantum solutions a reality. So again, appreciate the opportunity to speak. If we could go to the next slide, we're gonna hit three really important questions, or we're gonna ask and hopefully answer three really important questions about quantum. These are high level, but they're meant to really provide some context around what quantum is going to be and how fiber broadband is going to play into that. So the three questions we want to answer today is, what does a quantum future look like? We're probably going to get it a little wrong, so a lot of this is prophesizing, but we'll try and at least paint that picture of what the next 20 years looks like with the inclusion of quantum. The second is, how is a quantum fiber optic network different from a traditional fiber optic network? There's been a lot of talk around the technology of quantum, which is really interesting, the physics behind it, but what does that really mean for a fiber optic network? We'll touch on that. And then finally, we'll address why the quantum industry needs the help of broadband network providers today. That's not, we don't need the help 10 years in the future. We really need the help today. And part of my motivation for speaking today was to try and help enlist some support. So I'll go into more detail there towards the end of the presentation. If we could go ahead and go to the next slide, where I'd actually like to start off this talk with looking back at some old commercials from 1993. This is when AT&T was trying to kind of share their vision of the future with everyone through these "you will" commercials, they called them. And I apologize, the video is very low resolution. It's about a little over 2 minutes long, but if we could watch those videos and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about them, it's a great place to start. Thanks, appreciate you playing that. So the resolution isn't great there, but I actually remember those commercials, and it was great for sort of providing a picture of what that future is going to look like. However, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide, I think what's most interesting about those commercials is actually what they don't mention, which is they don't say the internet, right? A lot of those technologies came true. I sent a fax from the beach just last week, but no, that you've got email, you've got all these different sort of internet capabilities, but they don't mention internet because this concept of this massively interconnected country and then eventually the world, that infrastructure was still being laid. It was still just starting. But the internet was really what enabled all of those technologies. But we didn't have a word for it yet, or at least the public didn't have that concept in their mind. Just a year after those videos, there's a famous clip from the Today Show where Brian Gumbel's saying, "What is internet anyway?" It seems like they're just starting to scratch the surface, at least at the public level, of asking what that was. The reason I like to play that clip is because we're at essentially the same place in quantum. Quantum is now starting to have real applications. It's starting to require infrastructure that's needed to support it. And people are asking, what is quantum anyway? They're just now starting to be there. And we're going to see this explosion of all these capabilities over the next decade, 2 decades, that will allow our society to change quite a bit, just like the internet changed our society as well. If we could, let's go ahead and turn to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about really what quantum is going to do. Just one, in terms of time frame, this is just another quick picture showing sort of how fast technology progresses. This is 2005, the Pope is speaking, you see one cell phone. This is 2013, less than 10 years later, everybody's got these personal devices that they're capturing his speech on. This right here is about 20 years after that AT&T commercial. So a lot can happen in 2 decades. And of course, I'm talking to a group that knows that better than most. This advance in technology happens rather rapidly. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is this quantum technology? What is quantum after all? And you could spend an hour giving you could spend a few days giving a lecture on what quantum is, but I've tried to kind of really simplify it down to just the core essentials that you need to know to understand some of these new technologies. The first is this is leveraging technology of the very small. So we're all familiar with the physics that we live in, the macro world, but when you get down to the particle level, down to like a particle of light, a photon, or down to the tiniest atoms, you get these very strange physical effects that are bizarre to us, but it allows the world of the very small to function and operate. And we've been understanding this world for about 100 years, studying it, understanding it, developing quantum theory around it. And now we're starting to leverage those unique properties or unique physics. And 2 of those properties specifically are being leveraged today. The first is this idea that a single particle can actually be in 2 places at the same time. It actually could be in 100 places at the same time. This is the concept of superposition. We can observe this, we can exploit it, and that's kind of how quantum computers are one of the components that allows us to produce quantum computers. And the way I like to think of superposition and how it speeds up processing is today when you do a computational process in a classical computer, you're running data through a chain. Essentially, you multiply this, you add this, you do this next, you do this next. It's very sequential. With quantum systems, you can do the same thing down multiple parallel paths, and you can do it all at the same time. And so you get this massive speed up in terms of exploitation of this property. The second property is sort of the inverse of superposition. And the idea here is that you can have 2 particles that could be in very different places, but they act as a single particle. They act together, so they have correlated behavior. And that's called entanglement. And you can kind of think of that as almost the reverse of superposition. Entanglement allows us to have 2 particles that are very far apart, but they act almost like they were the same particle or they were right next to each other. That counter property is really critical for a lot of communication breakthroughs and sensing breakthroughs that we'll see with quantum. And so if you don't take anything else away from this on the physics side, these 2 physical properties, superposition and entanglement, which is really only possible at the level of the very small, is what's driving a lot of these technologies. Okay, so the result is that these new technologies, they're not just an iterative improvement over what we have. They're really a paradigm shift. They're revolutionary in terms of what they can do. So when we say there's powerful new quantum computers that are coming, we don't mean that they're going to be like 10 times as powerful as what we have today. We're talking about billions and billions of times more powerful on certain types of problems that we can't solve today. Even if we had the whole world was covered in supercomputers. We still couldn't solve these problems. They'll be solvable with quantum systems. So it's a radical change in terms of our capabilities. Same with sensors. We're able to break physical limits that we never would be able to break classically and get ultra high resolution or ultra high sensitivity out of these sensors. And then communication devices as well are able to achieve security and other benefits that we couldn't achieve with classical systems. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So in terms of where we're at with this, the 1993 AT&T videos are a good starting place, but you can also kind of show a larger context. Between 1980 and 2000, the computing, network, internet, all the operating systems, a lot of these core components of the internet and personal computers really came into being. So if you call this the classical information technology of those last 2 decades, we saw big companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Cisco becoming very dominant in these 3 spaces. That same process is happening again today. You can just put quantum in front of everything. Quantum computers, quantum operating systems, quantum networks, those are being built today, and we're seeing history repeat itself. But as it repeats itself, we've seen this story before, so we don't need to necessarily do it sequentially. And so what we're seeing today is quantum computers are being built at the same time as the operating systems are being developed that will one day run on them, as are the quantum networks that will tie together all of these systems. So they are more complicated, but we expect to see pretty rapid development and integration of these parts. And right now there's a lot of companies that are vying to own these spaces and be the clear winner, like the IBMs, the Microsofts, and the Ciscos did. So it's history repeating itself. Since we've seen this once before, we can use that knowledge to accelerate what we're doing today. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we ask ourselves, what does the quantum future look like? If AT&T was making its commercials today, and they were putting out these commercials and never mentioning quantum, but showing all the benefits that could come from it, what would they be? This is my best guess based on the work that we're seeing in the industry, algorithms that are being developed to run on quantum computers, where the money from venture capitalists is going. That'll help sort of identify what applications are going to be percolating out over the next 20 years. A lot of them are related to artificial intelligence, because we can train neural networks in a much more complete and sophisticated way with quantum computers. So the idea of a universal translator from Star Wars, from Star Trek, is definitely one of those things that we will likely see occurring over probably the next 10 years, really. So that will remove barriers, language barriers between workers and relationships and all different areas of life. Cure for some cancers that's related to protein folding algorithms that are looking at the dysfunction in protein folding that can run on quantum computers. Photorealistic virtual reality for work and education. We know the virtual world is coming. It's a little crude looking right now, and to be able to place yourself in that environment requires a lot of complex ray tracing, which quantum computers, they have algorithms related to optimizing and speeding up those processes. Natural conversations and body language used to communicate with AI-powered technology. If you have an Alexa, the way you will interface with that type of a product in the future, there's many like it, will be completely different from today. Very conversational, very expressive, where your body and your facial expression will be read by those devices, and they'll respond accordingly. That'll lead to better care for the disabled, the elderly, the sick, even our pets. We'll see some improvements there. Based on quantum sensing, we know that the sensitivity of weather-based solutions that can predict tornadoes, even detect early warnings of earthquakes, those kinds of sensors will come to the forefront. They'll be distributed across networks and have unique capabilities that we don't have today. Media customization with virtual actors and artists, that's something that also is being looked at in the quantum space. Basically, deep fakes that are much better than what we have today. And then gravitational waves is something no one's really talking about. But once you have a distributed sensor network, you actually can sense gravitational waves coming from space that will allow us to probe the universe in different ways and hopefully understand gravity better. I don't know how we ever get to a flying car, but maybe that's a critical step to getting there. A lot of this has already been kind of predicted and highlighted in different science fiction movies, and so I've got a couple of those on the right. But that's kind of what those AT&T commercials would look like if we hosted them today. It would really be about highlighting these benefits. Nobody would be mentioning quantum, but quantum would be what underlies it all. Okay, next slide, please. So when it comes to quantum networks, what are these exactly? We already know classical networks are used for sharing bits between multiple nodes. Quantum networks are essentially the same, except they're sending quantum bits across the optical fibers, or they shorten that to say qubits. And again, you could have a whole day just on what qubits are and how to build them, but for quantum networking perspectives, probably the easiest way to think of it is it's a single photon where you're controlling something like its polarization. And so you want to monitor the polarization, or you want to maintain the polarization of a photon as you send it from one node to the next. And you have to do it in a special way so that you're not constraining it too much. And in addition, all the other single photons that are being transmitted around the network, they have to be maintained and they have to be coherent with each other. So there's a couple of buzzwords I dropped in there. At the end of the day, though, it's really just about sending light around the network. It's just very, very tightly controlled and very dim light. It's basically a single photon, one of these particles that has these quantum behaviors. But those qubits would be shared over a fiber optic network that was specifically built to maintain them. Today, there are multiple quantum networks that are being developed in the United States and across the world for sure. Those early networks are primarily isolated. They're not interconnected. They tend to be kind of islands where the technology is brought together and is being used by smaller groups. So we have a lot of these isolated quantum networks popping up and have been for the last few years. Just this year, the first commercial quantum network where you can subscribe to it was deployed in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I believe that's the only commercial quantum network in the United States. I'm not sure about worldwide, but it's meant to support industry and bring others in to develop their products and to develop applications that they can test on this network, or that they can deploy, not test, but deploy on the network. Okay, next slide. The core technologies inside of these are really not that much different from traditional classical networks. So we have sources that produce these single photons or entangled photons that are going to be used and distributed across the network. We have detectors that can detect a single photon. So they're still, they're highly sensitive and high efficiency detectors that can detect with about 90% efficiency when a single photon arrives at a user. We've got electronics and precision timing to coordinate all of these detectors and sources across the network. And there's this last component, which is called coherency control. Again, I mentioned the polarization needs to be maintained across a fiber. Coherency is kind of related to that, and it ensures that everything, all the particles that are on the network are coherent with each other, which means they can interfere with each other. So there's a couple of new ideas in here, this idea of single photon detection and sources that only produce single photons or 2 photons at a time that might be entangled. But still, it's light going down an optical fiber, being detected, and then being correlated across the network. So still very similar to classical networks. Next slide, classical fiber optic networks. So if you want to see one of these systems, I mentioned FFB, which is a internet service provider as well as a utility in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They actually have deployed one of these. They have a number of these nodes on the network that are connected through, I think, over 216 strands of optical fiber. So it's just a metro level quantum network, but it is something where it can support up to 10 to 15 users, and people can come and subscribe to the network and get access to a lot of the common tools that you need to do quantum work. So when we talk about quantum sources and detectors, those are actually resources on this network that the users tap into and can utilize. The ultimate goal of those commercial quantum networks is to accelerate the development, the adoption, and the integration of quantum technologies, which will really start next year when this commercial quantum network launches. Next slide, please. And here's just a couple of quick pictures from this quantum network at FFB. The one I like the most is up here in the upper left. You actually see some of these sources, these detectors, some of this quantum equipment where it lives. It lives in something we call equipment hubs. Those equipment hubs are distributed around the city, and then user nodes that are attached to the network actually leverage those components. Next slide, please. So I know I'm running a little short on time, so I'll speed this up a little bit here. Where are we in terms of the comparison between classical and quantum fiber optic networks? Where are we in maturity-wise? Here's just a quick stack up showing kind of how the two compare. The biggest difference is the signal type. Instead of sending an optical pulse, a laser pulse, with billions and billions of photons down the fiber, you're sending just a single photon. And so the detection of that is going to be quite a bit different, and the preservation of that information is quite a bit different. So if you look at detectors and transmitters and those transceivers, whereas we've got mature and compact SFP lasers today, it's still very early stage, kind of bulky equipment with quantum. The good news is it's still the same wavelength bands. There's efforts to build optical repeaters. They're not there yet, but we're getting closer. And just like we were with the early days of those 1993 commercials, although traditional classical networks that are at 100 gigabits per second, we're in the 1 to 10 kilobits per second right now with transmitting photons between nodes in a quantum network. There's a lot of more interesting stuff I'd love to go into here. It's not just about transmitting photons. We actually can teleport them, which allows you to reduce the loss across the network, but I don't think I'm going to have time to dive into that much deeper than that. Next slide, please. Okay, so last piece here. We really need your help. Right now, the quantum technology is moving out of the laboratory and into the real world. And just like with the internet, there is some resistance to this because we don't have the broadband network providers necessarily involved and invested in a lot of these efforts. So you have a lot of national labs and universities that are trying to set up test beds, but we really need broadband network providers to be integrated in this process so we can roll out these quantum networks for commercial applications. If you're familiar with the history of the world, that was the world's first commercial internet service provider. They had the same kind of problem. In 1991, there was real resistance to them rolling out commercial, kind of publicly accessible internet. And finally, they were granted permission and by the National Science Foundation, and from there, the internet took off. That's where we're at today with quantum networks. We need to lay this infrastructure for quantum networks in order for all these applications to become possible. But in order to do that, we need broadband network providers' support and involvement in that. Next slide, please. That really should bring us to the end of this presentation so we can open it up for questions. But again, those 3 questions that we asked, I hope we've answered them a little bit. We're only scratching the surface a little in this presentation, but hopefully it gives you a feel for what's coming, how it's different from the classical networks, and why it's critical that we get the support of the broadband network providers today. All right, Gary, with that,
awesome stuff. So just only have really time for one question, and a lot of the questions coming in are similar in that, if we look at our classical fiber network and how is the quantum network going to be replace the classical network, or is it going to be synergistic, or how do we think about how this is going to go forward?
So right now, it's really another layer on top of our classical fiber optic networks, and that's partly because the quantum technology is still really delicate and immature, and so we need dedicated fibers just for the quantum network. But over time, we should see those two blend together, and that will, of course, allow us to much more quickly deploy this technology. Today, if you want to put a quantum network in the ground, you should be prepared to put fiber in the ground.
And the other part of the question is that the quantum internet can only exist on fiber networks. It can't work on coax or anything else, right?
That's correct. You actually have to physically send these photons down an optical fiber. The one exception is free space. There are some working on satellite-based systems where you can go further distances. But yeah, you've got to deliver the photon over a
So
fiber.
everybody living in a vacuum can use free space optics. But
Yeah, that's right. You're all good if you're in a vacuum.
yeah. So in essence, I mean, just the real quick takeaway is if your community doesn't have a fiber network, you'll be on the wrong side of the quantum internet.
Yeah, your community will be unable to tap into all of these, emerging applications. And quantum is coming. It's almost like this unstoppable force. You want to be ready for it. That infrastructure needs to be in place.
Wow, this is just amazing. And I think we need to dedicate like a whole week to having a discussion with you on this. This is awesome. But yeah, so unfortunately we're out of time. But Duncan, thank you so much, and really appreciate all the work that you and your company are doing to really advance, quantum networking. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we're going to get back together next Wednesday. We're going to be talking about the results from our service provider survey showing how much fiber is actually being deployed and some other trends. So please join us with Mike Render next Wednesday. With that, I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Thanks.